Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Corinne Flaherty. I am the library director at the G.A.R Memorial Library in West Newbury, Massachusetts. And before we get started tonight, I just wanted to thank the Friends of the West Newbury Library. Their fundraising efforts pay for all of our library programming. And I also wanted to thank the following libraries for partnering with West Newbury on this important program. We have representation tonight from communities up and down the length of the Merrimack River. And I want to welcome patrons from Amesbury, Andover, Ashland, Atkinson, New Hampshire, Boxford, Danvers, Dracut, Lowell, Manchester Community College, Nashua, New Hampshire, Newburyport, Tewksbury, and Tyngsboro. And of course, we welcome all of the West Newbury patrons as well. We will be taking questions after John's presentation. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. And if you have anything you'd like to share, feel free to put it in the chat. All right, with all that said, I'd like to introduce John Macone, Education and Policy Specialist at the Merrimack River Watershed Council. John is an Amesbury resident and has served as MRWC's Outreach and Education Manager since 2017. Prior to that, he served as editor of the Newburyport Daily News for 14 years, and he's hosted numerous presentations, boat tours, and walking tours throughout the Merrimack River region. Welcome, John. Thank you so much for being here. The floor is all yours. Take it away.
Thank you, Corinne. Thank you so much, Corinne, for inviting me to do this. Corinne contacted me a couple of months ago, and she was one of so many people who this year have noticed how dirty the Merrimack is and was concerned about it, wanted to know, what can be done. And so thank you for pulling this together, because I couldn't have asked for anything better. This is really so helpful. We have so many hundreds of people who are really worried about what's happening this year. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through basically this situation of why we have sewage going into the Merrimack River, why it's so dirty this year, and what's happening, and also what you can do to try to help to clean it up, because this river is all of our river. Nobody owns it. It is a public resource. Every one of us owns it, and so we really need to take responsibility and feel like this is our own thing to be watching and taking care of. So I'll tell you a little bit about this organization I'm a member of. Merrimack River Watershed Council. So we're a nonprofit. We were formed almost 50 years ago when the Merrimack was actually pretty much an open sewer. And I'll talk about that later. So our mission is really pretty simple. We just want this river to be cleaner and healthier to pass on to the next generation. And we use a variety of methods to do our work. We do a lot of scientific work, water testing. We educate children and adults. We do hikes and tours and kayak trips. We also do a lot of advocacy with local, state, and federal officials, work with them to basically come together and figure out what are some of the problems that we collectively can solve with the Merrimack River. And the people who are members of our group are, I think, the people who are probably on this webinar, people who live in the Merrimack Valley or beyond, or you have some affiliation with the river, or maybe you fish, or you boat on it, or you swim, or you just love nature. Those are the people who we count on to support us and to work with us. So if you're a member of MRWC, thank you so much. If you're not, take a look at our website, and please, if you can join us, that would be wonderful. So I want to start talking out a little bit about the Merrimack River Watershed itself. So this is a map that shows you where all the water that comes down the Merrimack comes from. This is a huge area. It's over 5,000 square miles. It's the fourth largest river in New England. Probably the most amazing fact, I think, is that there's 600,000 people who drink out of this river. This is their primary source of drinking water. And so it's the second largest source of drinking water in New England. The biggest one is the Quabbin, which is absolutely pristine. And we're number 2, and we're, not so pristine. So that's certainly something we want to change. As you probably know, this is a long history of being used as an industrial river. And so we've certainly paid the price for that. And but it is much cleaner than it was 50 years ago. So that's a positive thing. I like this map because it gives you a sense of what this river is really all about. And you can see on the western fringe of it, it's fringed by mountains and also to the north. This is just a vast basin of water. So let's take a look at some of the places where this water that comes from, that goes through our Merrimack Valley comes from. Franconia Notch is at the northernmost end. Lake Winnipesaukee also drains into the Merrimack. If you've climbed on Mount Monadnock on the eastern slope, all that water that's coming off that goes into the Merrimack River. Mount Wachusett, which is in central Mass. The watershed goes as far south as Hopkinton, Mass, where the marathon starts. So this is a vast area of New England. And of course, here is where it all exits into the ocean in Newburyport and Salisbury. So I pulled this photo up because this was making the rounds on social media earlier this summer and really upset a lot of people when they saw a lot of comments about what is going on. So this photo is taken in Merrimack, Mass, looking across at West Newbury. If you're familiar with this area, that's a Rocks Village Bridge, and you can see how brown the water is. And people, you know, hadn't seen anything like this in so many years. What is going on? So here's what's happened this year. As you know, we've had this incredibly wet summer. We've had twice as much rain as we normally have in a summer, and we've had some really intense storms. Last week, we had a storm that dropped 6 inches of rain in about 2 hours, which is a tropical downpour. So what happens when you have those storms? Well, every kind of contaminant that's already on the earth is going to get very quickly washed into the tributaries of the river and then into the river itself. There's oils and fertilizers and all sorts of pathogens that all make their way into the river very quickly. Another source of contamination is combined sewer overflows, which we're going to focus on in this talk. So that is actually sewage that is released by a handful of cities along the Merrimack. And another interesting that happened is that this year we broke several records over the period of about 2 weeks for record flows in the Merrimack. So there was so much water that was being dropped in northern New Hampshire through huge rainstorms that it all came just burrowing down the river. And so we saw the river running at rates that we never see in the summertime. So that tended to stir up the river a lot. So a lot of that brown that you saw that wasn't necessarily something like a CSO or something that was a pathogen, but that was actually just mud and dirt that was stirred up by all of this fast moving water. So you probably also recall that so many beaches all along the coast, not just along our local coast, were closed due to high bacteria levels. And that bacteria came from our rivers and all of this rain that was sweeping down. So I want to give you kind of a perspective on this summer too. This is, I've never seen a summer like this before. You know, I've been watching this for many years and recording what happens with CSOs in our river. And this is unprecedented from what I've seen. So 61 days, June and July, almost half of them, we had sewage discharges into the Merrimack. Generally, there's a 48-hour wait period before you can go in. So basically 2/3 of the days during that month were times when you couldn't go in the river for health reasons. And I've got a list of where these discharges happened. Most of them were from Lowell, and then a descending number from some of the other plants along the river. So this is really the new norm. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is a federal agency, studies climate change, and it's looked at rain patterns that are going to happen with climate change. And the Northeast is going to see a dramatic increase in these fast-moving, very strong storms. So this summer is really an indicator of what we will probably see in the future, almost every year. So I've talked a little bit about combined sewer overflows, and this is just kind of a quick explanation of what they are. So I think most people on this call might live in communities, if you're in a suburban community, that has what's called a separated sewer system. And what that means is that these systems were built with pipes that go basically from homes or for businesses, piped directly to a sewage plant. The sewage is treated there, and then the clean water is released into a river or water source. A combined sewer system is typical in a very old city. So in our area, it's Lowell, Lawrence, Haverhill, Nashua, and Manchester. And what happened is many years ago, the piping system was done in different ways, is built so that it also relieved the water that is dropped onto roads during storms. So these sewage systems also include rainwater that comes off the street. And what happens is it starts to get built up. There's too much volume. And so the sewage plant operators have two options. Either they allow it to build up, in which case it'll back up into people's homes, which, you know, wouldn't be terribly popular, or they have to release it into the river. And not a great option. They don't like doing it, but that's really their only option. So that's why we have these CSOs happen. So we're not alone in this part of the country. There are over 800 of these systems across the nation. If you look at this map, you can see they're mostly clustered around the Northeast and also around the industrial Midwest. So old communities that were built 150 years ago when there was a different standard of how to handle stormwater and wastewater. And so we're struggling now as a country to try to fix this problem. It's a very expensive problem to fix. So I'll talk about what's going on with the Merrimack and why we have this problem. This picture here is kind of funny looking thing, is a sewage discharge point in Lawrence. And you can see there's a net there and it collects some of the trash that comes through the sewer system. But most of the filthy water will come right through there when there's a CSO. So this goes back 200 years to the Industrial Revolution. So the Merrimack River is really unusual in that if we were to look at it, what it was like 200, 300, 500,000 years ago, it's a really dynamic river. It has a lot of falls along it. And so wherever you find a major city on the Merrimack, more than likely that's a place where there was a falls historically. And so falls were important when the Industrial Revolution began, because that's where power could be produced for your factories and your mills. And there was no electricity, of course, so that was your primary source of power. And the Merrimack River was like an incredible power source. So these cities sprung up all along it very quickly. First, there's Lowell, then Nashua, Manchester a few years later, and Lawrence. And these cities grew very quickly. You know, they drew in a lot of immigrants, and there was a lot of call for what they were producing. And so they grew incredibly rapidly. So it's interesting, Henry David Thoreau is the first person that we have who starts to see that there's a problem, a serious environmental problem that's being caused by these cities. He took a canoe trip with his brother. 1839, this is a few years after Lowell was founded, and he already starts to see that the river is changing, and for the worse. He's starting to see that it's dirtier. He's starting to see that there's a lot of impact being caused by the dams, especially to fish populations. And he calls the Merrimack River a mere wastewater, as it were, bearing little but its fame from Lowell to the sea. So here's a photo from the 1890s to give you a sense of how the river was being impacted by humans along these cities. And these folks have no real sewer system. They live along the banks of the canals in some places, in tenements. All of the wastewater is going into the canals that were built there or directly into the river. That's just the way it was. You know, this is the accepted practice. Here it comes right out of the mouth of the president of the New England Water Works. Waterworks man must and rightly should accept a certain amount of sewage pollution in river water and make the best of it. So that was the opinion. You just made good with it. Of course, that's not the best way to do things. So I'm going to fast forward here, the 1960s. If you were around at this period, you remember, sure, just the environmental catastrophes that were happening in the United States and elsewhere. Things were really getting pretty out of control with smog and pollution. So this top photo that you see of a fire, that's actually a river that's on fire. That's the Cuyahoga River in Ohio. And when this happened, it caused a real furor with people. You know, it's such a visceral image of what is happening to our environment. And this photo to the lower right, this river, it looks like a blood red river. That's actually the Nashua River, which connects into the Merrimack in Nashua, New Hampshire. And that is dye that was dumped into it. And pretty much every day, the river would change color depending on whatever dye they were using in the factory. And that was just the way it was done. You know, that had been going on for dozens and dozens of years. So there was a campaign, you know, people wanted to see this end. Perhaps some of you remember this image of the Native American with a tear in his eye. And commercials that went on around that to get people really fired up about cleaning up the environment. And that worked. In 1972, the Clean Water Act passed. And what that act did was it pumped billions of dollars to communities all across the nation to build sewer plants. It clamped down on polluters. It created all kinds of new standards to really tighten up what was happening in the environment. So here's where the Merrimack was in 1974. It was literally a river of sewage. So if you talk to people who lived around here back then, they'll tell you how badly it smelled. People didn't want to live along the river, and this is why it was really an open sewer, because there were no sewer plants except for the one plant in Newburyport. So it was about 46 billion gallons of sewage going to the river every year. So right now, as bad as things feel, we are producing about 1% of that, 1%. So we've come a long way. So all this money resulted in a building boom of sewage plants. So now all along the river, every community that that was just openly dumping sewage into the river now has a sewage plant. So here's an example, a great photo, I think, that gives you an idea of how much things have changed. 1960s, you see that Nashua River image, and this is the same area today. It's clean, you can swim in it. It's, you know, it's a natural habitat. We have eagles that have returned. We have fish populations that have returned. So we've made a tremendous change in our environment. Something we can be proud of. So the result of this, the good news is that on most days, and I'm talking about dry days, if it's been an extended dry period, that the Merrimack River is so clean you can swim it. And as I mentioned, it's also a source of drinking water for hundreds of thousands of people. But what we're going to focus a little bit on here is on those bad days, and that's where we need to fix things. When it rains, we have this problem with these communities that historically had their piping incorrectly built. You know, is built to a different standard, and it is tremendously expensive to replace it and fix it. And in general, these are communities that don't have significant financial means. So they're really, the people who live there today are strapped with something that was created 100, 200 years ago, a system that they're still trying to work their way out of. So our feeling at MRWC is that we'd like to see this region come together and sort of understand this, that this is a generations long problem. It's not related to how people are acting right now. And we need to gather around and try to help these communities to fix their problems. So where does this CSO waste come from? So there's two major communities that produce the bulk of it: Manchester, New Hampshire, and Lowell, Mass. And you can see there are some other communities, and 3 other communities that are much less than 20%. And this is a chart that gives you an idea of how much sewage is actually coming into the river. And see, it goes up and down every year. This is from 2013 to 22. So the years when it's really down are the years where we've had droughts. And the years where it's pretty high are years when we've had abnormally high rainfall. So this year, I don't know yet. I'm going to guess it's going to be significantly higher than last year, that's for sure. And maybe one of the highest years we've had in the past decade. So if you've been in the river or on the beach and come out and had some sort of a skin problem, or maybe you felt sick to your stomach, or maybe you had a cut or something that got reinfected, there's a possibility that CSO water, so this is basically human sewage, was the cause of it. So this is bacteria that's in the water that gets into your skin, or unfortunately, if you drink it in somehow, or perhaps if you've got a dog and the dog is out swimming in the river, that is fairly common that we see that the dogs get these terrible rashes because it gets built up into their fur, or they drink the river water. So in general, you'll see if you're familiar with the announcements that we make after a CSO event, we ask you to stay out of the river for 48 hours. So this is just sort of a general advisory, usually how long it takes for bacteria to break down. But it's really hard to say if that is the actual correct amount of time. It's kind of amazing to me that we don't actually know on the Merrimack. There's just not enough resources that are put into figuring out when an area is safe to swim in, because sometimes after a CSO, an area might be fairly safe, or maybe it's incredibly polluted because it's just an area where there's pollution that builds up. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, about some potential solutions to that. But when you're encountering a year like this, where you've had these constant rainstorms, 48 hours may not be enough. So we do a lot of water testing at MRWC, and we've noticed their patterns of where there's a lot of contamination, particularly after a CSO. So roughly the area from Lowell to West Newbury often has the worst conditions for bacteria after a CSO event or after a rainstorm. So as I mentioned earlier, there are other sources of pollution. So if there's a pathogen in the water, it may not necessarily be from a CSO. It might be some kind of a pathogen that washed into the river from a stream or from somebody's home or something like that, or from their yard, or dog waste even. But this is the region where we see that there is a lot of contamination that happens after a storm. So there are a lot of people who use the river down around Newburyport and Plum Island. So this area is a tidal zone, and our testing indicates that there's less chance that you're going to see contamination. And there are exceptions to that. You know, we hear a lot about Plum Island and Plum Island Basin. So there are areas where water might tend to collect and kind of circulate around. We'd like to understand that better and to figure out where those places are. But so this is kind of a generalization. You might find a place where you say, ooh, the water doesn't look good there. If that's the case, you may want to stay out of it. So, you know, we're now 50 years past the Clean Water Act passage, and they thought that within about 20 years, a lot of these problems would be solved. They clearly haven't. So why hasn't it happened here? So on the Merrimack, this is a problem that's going to cost at least $1 billion. And this is really disruptive work. This involves tearing up streets, you know, all the destruction that causes, and also to homeowners and expense to the city. So this is an expense that most cities cannot afford on. The other thing is that the EPA wants this to end, as do these communities, but it can't happen very quickly because of this expense and this disruption. And so there are orders in place, enforcement orders on all of these communities to say you must get this done, but it's usually a very long window, could be 10 or 20 years. And you know, at the end of 10 years, you might have to have your CSO volume reduced 50%. And then at that point, there's a reassessment. So every time you reduce that CSO amount, that amount that's left to reduce that is very expensive. And there's almost a mathematical formula you can follow to see how that cost goes up exponentially to reduce and reduce and reduce. One of the questions we get a lot is this river tested regularly for bacteria? And yes, we do test it a lot. There are a lot of different groups that test it for all sorts of different reasons. Every year we get together and we talk about what we're testing for. It's a little bit like herding cats sometimes, because each of us is doing something differently. But this is a good way for us to get together and figure out, okay, where are the places that we're missing, and how do we take care of that and make sure we have a really complete picture of what's happening with the Merrimack and with bacteria in it. So there is a big kind of gap in this, and that is that after CSO events, there is no testing that's happening. And sometimes the regular tests we do coincide with the CSO. I'll tell you why there is no CSO testing happening. For one thing, there's really no funding for it. The other thing is it's quite difficult. And that is because you have to send people out usually every 12 hours to 24 hours after a CSO or during a CSO event and afterwards. And it's hard to find people who are going to do that along the length of the Merrimack. We're talking 20, 30 people. We use volunteers. It's a lot of burden. And also to get those samples get back to a lab, get them tested. I'd love to see it happen. Our organization would love to see it happen, but right now it does not seem feasible. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, about some potential solutions to this. So if you're interested in learning more about some of this testing that goes on, if you go onto our website, and I have an address here at the bottom of this slide, you can see the bacteria monitoring results that we've done over the past couple of years. And there are 13 different locations along the river, and maybe one of them is near a place that you're familiar with or that you visit. And you can see some of the patterns of what's going on with bacteria. And what this tells you is what it's like during the dry conditions and what it's like during the wet conditions. In this case, I picked this spot in West Newbury, and this is near the Rocks Village Bridge. And one thing you can see here is when it's a red in a circle, red isn't good. Blue is better. So in this particular case, at this location, there is an abnormally large amount of bacteria that we find after wet events. We don't fully understand why. It probably has to do with the dynamics of the river. There's also a lot of ducks that hang out here, so that can contribute to it. But we find this all along the river. There are areas that are fairly clean, and then suddenly there's a place that's very dirty. We like to understand that better. So do the plants have to tell the public when releases occur? And the answer is yes, finally they do. It's pretty amazing to me to think that it took so long to get this to happen. There was a law that many of us watershed groups were trying to get passed statewide to require that sewage plants tell the public when they release sewage. It took 7 years for it to pass in our legislature. You might think, hey, this seems like a no-brainer. But some of these fights are difficult, and that's where people come in. Your voice is so important to help to push these matters ahead. So this law finally passed. It's not nearly perfect, but it's a step in the right direction. So in Massachusetts, all of our plants are required to issue public reports by email. So maybe some of you are already on those email trains. In New Hampshire, there's not a state law, but the EPA is stepping in and trying to make sure that it happens. And they do that through the permits that they issue to the plants. So Manchester is now actually one of the most forward thinking and reporting of all the plants we see, so that you can not only get email from Manchester, you can also find out, go onto a map and see exactly where the sewage is coming out, and you can get figures for how much sewage has come out during events. So that's pretty far ahead of the game. So if you've been, this summer in particular, we have people who are saying, well, how do I find out if a CSO happened. You know, these laws have come into place, so that's great. So you can sign up for alerts from the sewage plants. You can go onto their websites and you type in CSO, and you'll typically find a screen that'll allow you to sign up for email. Each plant does it a little differently, so they can be a little bit hard to understand, but that is, you know, in compliance with the law. And that's a way for you to find out. We've been taking all of these reports and we put them all together, collate them onto our Facebook page. So if you want to go onto our Facebook page, we're going to tell you which plants are releasing. If we have any data that's of significance, we're going to tell you there. And so that's a one source shopping place to find it. There's some communities that are posting on their websites. For example, your report's health department is, so they'll give you an alert if something is happening. And also the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission is doing something pretty interesting. They've been working on what's called a predictive model that will tell you, based on the amount of rain that's happened and some of the data they have from the past, about whether or not the Merrimack is unsafe to go. So if you go onto their website, you're going to find this CSO predictive monitor. And it's now being expanded. At this point, it mostly covers Newburyport, but in the future, several months from now, I expect they're going to be showing other locations along the river. So we're looking forward to that. So what progress is being made on all of this? I mentioned earlier that there was this law that was passed to alert the public when sewage is dumped into the river. So that's a great start. And what that helps to do is not only that's a public health issue so that we're all better informed, it also puts it on people's radar screen. It says, hey, why is this still happening? Because this has been happening for, you know, well over 100 years. Why hasn't it stopped? Our money, our public money goes to so many different purposes, and we want to make sure that this isn't lost among the crowd of other needs. This is an important need, especially when you look at a river like the Merrimack that is used for recreational purposes pretty widely. The EPA has issued consent decrees, which basically forces communities to take certain steps. So recent years, both Haverhill and Manchester have had some pretty substantial work done on their systems. Manchester's spending $250 million right now to fix its systems, and they're doing a lot of work, really positive work. So we think we're going to see the numbers, the CSO figures in Manchester drop significantly. So on the other end of the spectrum is Lowell. Remember earlier I mentioned Lowell is the other major contributor to CSO waste. Right now, Lowell is negotiating with a consent decree with the EPA, and that's been going on for about 1.5 years. Nothing has come out of it yet. This is a secret type of negotiation that goes on. So I wish I could tell you what the hangup is, but I don't really know. But we're hopeful that that gets resolved soon, because as you may know, there's a lot of money that the federal government has expended into the infrastructure law. And that's a 5-year window of time that money can be accessed. We're about 1.5 years into it, so we'd love to see Lowell's problems fixed and this consent decree signed sooner rather than later. A little bit about what MRWC wants to see. So I was mentioning about how hard it is to find out what's going on with bacteria in the river. You know, the system we use is, it's pretty antiquated, and this is a common system across this country. We send out people to take samples of water from a water source. You run them back to a lab as fast as you can. It takes about a day to get the sample studied, and then you get the results. And so the results are a day old. And there's a lot of running back and forth. Well, there are actually now some automated monitors that can be put into a river. They look like buoys, and you can hit a button. They're contacted by the internet, and they will start to take a sample, and they will test that sample right within that unit. And within a few hours, you'll have an idea of what the pollution levels, what the bacteria levels are in that river. That's such a better way to go. We'd love to see that happen on the Merrimack. It's expensive, but this is again an area where people can say, hey, I want this, this is important to me. Let's make this happen, and to talk to our state and local and federal officials and see that this happens. So I mentioned I'd like to see this public alert system improved. I think if you're a user, it's pretty hard to understand, what you're looking at when you see these emails. It would be just so much easier if you could go on to say an app or something like that and say, I want to go kayaking on the Merrimack. What's it like? And this app could tell you, yeah, it's safe or it's not safe, or here's areas where it is or it isn't safe. I think we can do that. And it's just going to take some work and some support from our government to put this into place. I mentioned Lowell CSO problems. We feel like Lowell's a community that's going to really need a lot of help, and it's something for us to all get our hands around and to see what we can do to help Lowell. Green infrastructure. This is a great way to go when we're trying to deal with these problems of pollution, these big flooding events that we see happening. Because normally what happens is all that water gets into a pipe or something and it goes right into the river. That's not the greatest way to handle this. It's better if we are able to kind of capture that water and to let it naturally settle down, or to hold it into enormous tanks underground. And then once things dry out, to pump that water back through a sewage system and have it cleaned out. So Manchester, for example, is installing an enormous pipe, a holding tank that's going to hold, I'm not sure how many millions of gallons. And that's exactly what it's for. And this is a great use of infrastructure money. It's going to clean up the river. And it's also going to be a better way to handle stormwater. We'd love to see more comprehensive studies of public health and the impacts of CSOs. We don't really know that much about it. It's as much of a health problem as this is in the Merrimack Valley. We don't have a lot of data on it. And then lastly, just to see more resources put at this problem in the Merrimack Valley. A lot of our resources in Massachusetts get directed towards Boston and some of the bigger communities that are perhaps better politically connected than ours. So we'd like to see our region work better together as a single voice to say, hey, this is such an important river. We really need to be focused on cleaning this up, and we want these resources. So this is my last slide. Thanks for your patience. And I'll take questions if you have any. So here's some things you can do. Stay informed on this stuff. It's just, I know I threw a lot of stuff at you, and you might say, well, what do I do? It seems like too much. First thing to do is to just watch the news. You can subscribe to our newsletter, get newspapers, even look at Facebook and stuff like that. Just stay informed about what is happening right now. In our newsletters, we send out information about when there's legislation or there's an issue that's coming up that we need public advocacy on, and that's a way you can respond. Making your voice heard is something that you can do in many different ways. It's by being informed and by talking to other people who may not understand what's going on and to enlighten them. Maybe it's writing a letter to the editor of a newspaper or contacting your state or local officials, your mayor, your city councilors, your state reps, senators, your congress people, and just saying, this is a problem. You've got to help us with this. And here are some suggestions. When they hear from you, it makes a big difference. I've talked to legislators who say, if I hear from 50 people or 100 people on an issue, that tells me it's a really important issue, and I'm going to be paying closer attention to that. So your voice is very important. And the last thing is just advocate, for this is your river, and to treat it as something that's in your backyard, and to consider it yours, and to get out there and talk about the Merrimack, enjoy the Merrimack, talk about the good things about it, but also say, hey, I'm concerned about it, and this is what I'd like to see happen. So that's my presentation. Thank you so much for your patience. I can see there's some questions lining up. So please go ahead and fire them away. See if I can answer them.
Thank you so much, John. This is just such a disturbing issue, and it's helpful to know that, you know, our voices can make change if we all collectively do something about it. So I hope that, you know, people start reaching out to their elected officials to try to get money put toward this. We've got some questions here, and let's see here. Paulina asked, has anyone studied the health effects of the CSOs on people who use the river or drink from the river?
Yeah, great question. And the answer is no. There was one study that was done about 10 years ago that looked at one hospital was in Lawrence, actually 2 hospitals. And it looked at the number of people who were admitted to the emergency room after a CSO, and they saw that there was a spike. It was about 11% increase. They also did comparisons to other communities that had a similar rainfall, communities that didn't have CSOs, and they found that there was no difference. So there is clearly something that's happening during CSOs. And somehow people are coming into contact with that water. We don't necessarily know if they're in the water or if there's some other way that they're in contact. But yeah, that would be a fantastic thing to study.
Sharon asked, how affected is the Parker River with CSO discharge?
There are no CSOs on the Parker River. So if there's pollution in the Parker, that's going to be coming from the runoff that might come out of people's yards or animal waste, that sort of thing.
Amy asked, why is there such a large gap in E. coli sampling area between Manchester and Lowell?
Yeah, good question. We don't have sites there. So we have a fairly limited number of people who volunteer to do testing. So our testing isn't in that area. There's some other groups that are testing along there. For example, the Souhegan River Watershed Group is testing in some places along there.
Laura says the EPA Region 1 has clearly stated that there is no exception from Clean Water Act prohibitions for CSOs. They are not permitted. Have there been citizen suits against Lowell and other non-complying towns to compel compliance? If prior EPA enforcement actions have been a bar, then what has been the process and opportunity for commenting on proposed consent orders, including currently pending ones?
Okay, that's an interesting question. So there have been no recent suits. I'm not sure if there were any, you know, my time period doesn't go back, say, 20 or 30 years. There are none in our area right now regarding CSOs. There has been some talk about it. What we're trying to do right now is a different route, and that is to pass legislation at the Mass State House to create something called the Merrimack River Coalition is the name. And what we're going to do is we're going to get all of the public officials from these communities together periodically, maybe every 2-3 months, to talk about what the problems are, to look at studies, and we're going to do some work on this, and to identify, you know, what the common problems are in the Merrimack Valley, and to work towards a solution. I noted Lowell. Lowell is clearly going to be a problem, and so we want to see that there's a positive solution for Lowell. I know there are people who would perhaps like to see a suit happen. I don't know if that will happen. I can't speculate on that, I guess, right now, but I could say that there is an effort to try to work cooperatively. And this legislation has the support of every legislator in the Merrimack Valley, which is pretty unusual. We get all of them to agree. So they all see it as a priority. And there was more to that question. I'm not sure if I answered all of it. I'm sorry.
I think you got most of it. It was a multi-part question.
Okay.
Someone's asking, Steve is asking, why would a consent decree need to be negotiated? If money is available, wouldn't a city take it and fix things? What are the objections? Homeowners, et cetera.
Right. So a consent order is it's basically like a legal settlement where you're going to have certain certain goals that you have to meet, certain timetables, and so behind that, there's going to be a lot of expense that you're going to have to figure out a way to afford, and so that's a point with a lot of these communities where I think they look at it and say, well, we have all these other competing interests, schools and crime and you name it. How are we going to afford to do this piece? And what can we do? How do we negotiate this? It really comes down to negotiation between the parties. And I wish I knew more about what was going on behind the scenes so I could tell you more about it. I don't.
Sally asks, she says, I live in Lowell. Does this affect my drinking water?
So yeah, in Lowell, you drink from the Merrimack River, but the CSOs are not directly impacting your drinking water. So your water is treated very thoroughly. And so the problem you would have is, if you're trying to go into Merrimack in Lowell, to swim at a beach or something.
All right, we have a few more here. Ken said, you mentioned various nonprofits working on different river-related projects. Is there any type of oversight board that helps coordinate and direct this work?
I'm sorry, what kind of work?
You mentioned various nonprofits working on different river-related projects.
Okay, yeah, so we do get together fairly regularly to try to figure out where there's commonality and what we can do together. And there are a lot of projects that are going on in different areas of the Merrimack where you've got state and federal and local officials, nonprofits working together. I can give you an example. For example, there's a dam removal that's being proposed on the Concord River. And that's a lot of different groups getting together to do that. And that's going to improve water quality on the Concord and ultimately help water quality in the Merrimack as well. When it comes to these CSO issues, we talk to a lot of different groups that are involved in this, including some of the federal agencies. It's amazing how many groups are doing different sort of siloed things along the Merrimack that collectively, when we talk together, we get ideas like, hey, you're doing that fits in with what we're doing. Maybe we can come up with a better idea. So I'll give you an example of that. The United States Geological Survey has a series of buoys along the Merrimack, testing stations. And there's one that's off of Newburyport right now. If you go onto their website, and I can provide that for people if they want to see it later, it tells you what's going on in the Merrimack right now. So now these folks are connected to USGS down in New Jersey, and that bureau has started using these bacteria monitors. And so there's a connection there we've made to say, hey, it's working down there. Let's start bringing it up here. And so USGS in this area says, hey, that's a great idea. We're gonna talk to the people down in New Jersey about what they're doing, and let's see if we can bring that up here. So there is collaboration that goes on between nonprofits and government agencies and between nonprofits. So we all benefit from that.
So this question is also from Ken, and you sort of touched on it with your last answer. What would you like to see in a centralized notification system for CSOs?
Yeah, so so for Ken, I'd like you to be able to go on your computer on your phone or something and say, I want to go boating or swimming in the Merrimack River. Is it safe today? And you're going to get that information in a format that's really simple for you to see. And you say, oh, the Merrimack, is contaminated today. What about the Ipswich or something, another river? And to have a system that's just user-friendly. The current system just isn't.
John Durant asked, is there a combined effort by the cities along the river to obtain money from the Infrastructure Act?
No, there's not a combined effort. They're each doing their own thing. And one of the issues we encounter in our area is there's some of the cities struggle to just to get by with some of the basic infrastructure that they need to maintain. I'm talking like roads, trash pickup, and sewer lines that might break, or water lines that break, and they end up getting so focused on that, and that's essential. But they're not able to tackle these larger problems that are happening, and sometimes they have a lot of turnover within their departments, so that kind of slows that progress down. So yeah, the quick answer is no, they're not really coordinated what they're doing. So that's what we want to do with this coalition group, is to get people together and to get them to understand what the problems are, and to work together to focus on getting the biggest bang we can get for our buck to fix some of these issues.
Ken has one more question. Is it $1 billion total to fix all the city's issues, or is it $1 billion per city approximately?
Okay, good question. Yeah. So when I say $1 billion, that's gonna meet the basic consent orders that are in place right now. And so those are not going to completely solve the problem. So let's say they're going to reduce the flow by maybe 50%. That's a big chunk, but it's not going to solve it completely and end it. So, even if we solve CSOs, this river is still going to have contamination from runoff. So we'll always have this problem. But one of the reasons why we focus on CSOs is because in each community, you're talking about a handful of pipes that go into the river, and so it's sort of a controlled environment. You can work on shutting those pipes off and fixing those problems. Whereas when you have what's called non-point pollution, which is just the runoff that goes into a river, much harder to control.
Eric asked, how much are those automated water testing systems?
Yeah, so good question. I've been looking into that. It looks like you can lease them, and you can potentially buy them. I know Lowell bought one, cost them about $35,000. That's just for one. And there's also a lot of maintenance involved. So you have to go out and install testing equipment into them. They can only do 7 tests, and then they have to be, there has to be a new set of tests that are installed into them. So, you're talking, let's say one of them, you might be talking $40,000, $50,000 over a period of years. We'd love to see, I think you could put, I don't know, 6 or 8, 10 in the Merrimack easily. Put them in places where people are accessing. There are all kinds of places along the Merrimack, boat ramps or little islands where people are pulling up onto, sand beaches, stuff like that. If we place them in those sort of locations, we're going to get a better idea how safe it is for people really coming into contact.
Someone asked, do we have any data on the effects of CSO pollution on wildlife, i.e. fish and waterfowl? Any evidence of decreasing populations and disease?
Yeah, there's no data on that. That's a good question.
I can speak to that just from like an observational perspective. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I live on Plum Island and I walk the beach every morning. And in June, I saw a heartbreaking number of sick or dead seagulls and other seabirds during the height of when it was really bad. And that's not along the river, that's along the ocean. So it seemed to be directly correlated. Of course, that's not a scientific answer, but just observational.
It's interesting. Yeah, there's so much about this that we really don't know, and we should know. Another one we've thought about is dogs. There are a lot of people, I think in Cashman Park in Newburyport, who let their dogs, or in Plum Island, let their dogs go into the water. And it might be a day or two after a storm, and that might be at that point in the river where the contamination is reaching its height. So, but it would be great to somehow coordinate this with vets and find out, okay, what's happening with animals, pets, and how much of a concern it is. We get a lot of anecdotal stories from people, heartbreaking stories and photos of dogs in particular that have these terrible rashes or they get really sick going into the river.
This is another question related to CSOs affecting fish. Is it okay to eat the fish?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm a fisherman and I don't eat fish out of the Merrimack really ever. Ocean, yeah. Especially this year, I wouldn't eat fish out of the Merrimack.
Joseph asked, how would you characterize the congressional leadership from Massachusetts and New Hampshire in getting funding to address this issue?
Yeah, so the 4 representatives from our region, so that would be Lori Trahan, and I'm gonna mess up the names here. I'm sorry. Anyways, our New Hampshire reps, Lori Trahan. My wife's throwing in on me here. Anyway, that's right, Seth Moulton. Sorry, Seth Moulton. So yeah, they've been on top of this. They've filed bills, and they've tried. They've been very good about understanding what the problem is and to try to help. But it's tough to get things through Congress. And this is they've gotten a little bit more funding. The infrastructure bill helped a lot, but they work well with us. I'll give a real shout out to Lori Trahan too. She has been absolutely on top of this and one of our biggest boosters for the Merrimack River.
Bruce Tarr wrote in to say that we have filed the legislation and are working as a regional delegation to get it passed. I'm the lead senator sponsor, the lead Senate sponsor, and Representative Shand is the lead House sponsor. We will need a lot of public support. Senate bill is S.586. House bill is H.905. We deeply appreciate John's partnership. Thank you, Bruce. I'll include that information in I'm going to send an email out tomorrow with a link to this recording, and I'll put in that information from Bruce Tarr. I'll also include any links that people requested, and I'll also include links to sign up for all of the notifications from the different cities that release.
Great. Yeah, Bruce and Don have been terrific on this. Thanks so much.
So we have time for a couple of more questions here. Let's see, Lisa said Byron Lane has proposed a more punitive approach to solving a CSO problem, namely finding communities who dump sewage $50,000 each time a CSO occurs. Can you comment?
Yeah, I can understand his sentiment, but it's not going to do anything. They're not technically breaking any laws because they have these. They are in violation of the Clean Water Act, but they basically have a waiver. So, and that waiver is going to allow them to continue to do this. It's a necessity, basically. If they don't do this, it's going to back up into people's homes, and that's unacceptable. So, yeah, I do get where he's coming from, but our feeling is it's better to try to understand where the problems are and to work with these communities that are having the problems, and to work as a united voice of the Merrimack Valley. And let's see how that works. If it doesn't work, maybe we go with a different path and get a little more litigious or something. But let's see what happens.
Kate asked, how will rising sea levels interact with the problems posed by CSOs?
Yeah, so that's a real interesting question. So Newburyport is one of the communities very worried about this and has good reason to be. So Newburyport gets its drinking water from the Artichoke River. If you've been down Route 113 and between Newburyport and West Newbury, you go down this kind of a low spot and you look over and you'll see a dam there. It's a very low dam. And on the other side of that dam is your drinking water. On this side is water from the Merrimack River. So as ocean levels rise, if we get some of these incredibly huge weather events that flood the Merrimack River with all kinds of contaminants, including CSOs, the worry is that that pollution is going to get pushed over the dam and into Newburyport's drinking water. Newburyport's very much aware of this. So that is a real world impact on your drinking water from CSOs. So Newburyport's solution is they want to raise that dam so that there's a protection. You know, I'm not sure how many feet, but it will go up, and that is going to buy time for Newburyport. I'm not aware of any other communities that would have that kind of a specific threat from sea level rise.
Let's see here. There's many more questions, but we don't have time to answer all of them, unfortunately. I'm just looking through to see if I can see some that we haven't touched on yet. David asked, what is the best way to pursue planting rain gardens in Haverhill? What kind of permits would have to be obtained by the city? As the city is located on a hill, I would think it would be a particularly impactful solution to reducing the amount of water in the city's sewer system.
Yeah, good point. So that's an example of green infrastructure. So you keep that water contained in an area that's basically almost like a swamp or something, like, you know, a swamp it gets created when it gets wet and it percolates down into the soil. So yeah, it really depends on where it is. You know, that's something we're very much interested in seeing happen throughout the Merrimack Valley. So if people want to talk to me offline about these things, I'm happy to talk to you. If you want to send me an email, and you know, other people who I work with who are much more experts in these areas, and maybe there's something we can do.
Yeah, I'll also include your contact information in the email I send out tomorrow.
Thank you.
Get ready, you might get a slew of emails. All right, let's see. We'll take one more question. So I believe Haverhill has added hundreds of condos, apartments, and lofts in CSO areas, and I imagine all the cities have. Shouldn't we put a moratorium on new housing until it's fixed?
I know people have talked about that. I don't think any community is considering doing that at this point. You know, we have this, on the other hand, we have this housing crisis in Massachusetts. So where is the balance between those? I don't know. You know, that's something that you can discuss within your community to see where people fall on it. But it's not really part of the discussion right now of the CSO issue.
All right, well, John, thank you for answering all of those questions and for giving us all this information. I'm really glad that you agreed to do this tonight, and I'm really grateful that the 13 other communities joined, because it really helped spread the word. We had over almost 400 people sign up for this webinar tonight. So, you know, whether or not they attended tonight, they'll all get a link to the video, and hopefully it'll make some sort of impact.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone, and thanks for the great questions.
Yeah, thank you. I hope everyone has a great night, and thanks again to John and the Merrimack River Watershed Council. Good night, everyone.